Hello, and welcome to the Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm Lori Sundberg, and I'm the president of Kirkwood Community College, and we are proud to be a sponsor of this year's conference. The Iowa Ideas Conference brings educational sessions on a variety of topics to Iowans from across the state. It is a fantastic conference, and we are proud to be a part of it. From all of us at Kirkwood Community College to all of you, I hope you enjoy the conference this year, and once again, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zach Kacharski. I'm the executive editor at the Gazette, and I hope everyone's been having a great day one. Just a reminder on our social media hashtag, it's Iowa Ideas 23. Immediately following the keynote, we'll do a speed networking session where you get to meet different attendees and share some of the takeaways from today. And I want to give one more thank you to all of our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, track sponsors, UFG Insurance, Inclusive ICR, ACT, our content sponsors, Cedar Rapids Bank and Trust, Cedar Rapids Metro Economic Alliance, and of course, what's brought us back together, our keynote sponsor, Kirkwood Community College. I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Frances Haugen. Frances is an American data scientist, an algorithmic product manager, and a whistleblower. Originally from Iowa City, she's a graduate of Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering and the Harvard Business School, and she's worked at Google, Yelp, and Pinterest before joining Facebook in 2019 to work in its civic integrity department. In 2021, she disclosed tens of thousands of pages of internal documents to the SEC and the Wall Street Journal, revealing Facebook's awareness and complicity in radicalization and political violence around the world. Her book, The Power of One, was released earlier this year. Please welcome to the Iowa Ideas, Frances Haugen.
Good morning, or at least morning where I am. Good afternoon in Iowa. My name is Frances Haugen, and I am a child of Iowa. I grew up there, and I have spent a lot of the last 2.5 years traveling around the world, trying to talk about what should be our, society's relationship with social media in an accountability and transparency way. So back in 2021, my life changed very dramatically because I had always spent my life kind of behind the scenes. Most of us take for granted that when we open Facebook and see a stream of posts, or Pinterest, or Netflix, for that matter, YouTube, there are people behind the scenes that are writing computer programs to figure out what should you see next. Should you see this video? Should you see that video? I spent most of my life always working on those systems, be it at Google, be it at Yelp, be it at Pinterest, or eventually at Facebook. When I got to Facebook, I began to see a variety of things that really concerned me. So I joined the company because I thought I was going to work on preparing the United States for the 2020 election. I joined in 2019. I got there and found out that I was going to start a new team, a team that was focused not on, taking down individual pieces of bad content if, say, a journalist wrote a fact check, but I was going to work on misinformation everywhere in the world where third-party fact-checking did not exist, which it turned out was most of the world. We think of fact-checking and we think of scandals. Maybe I get conspiracy theorists sometimes say she's the one who took down the Hunter Biden laptop. That's that third-party fact-checking program. For most of the world, Facebook doesn't have good security systems. They don't have journalists who are looking at stories. They have, they may sound really crazy sitting in Iowa, looking at a version of Facebook that seems pretty innocuous, that in places like Ethiopia or Myanmar, tens of thousands of people have died because those social media systems were weaponized. And when I got this job, I had never thought before about the idea that something that seems innocuous, when we look at it as Americans using the English language version of Facebook in the United States, that could actually cause ethnic violence half a world away. And so as I was in that job, I learned that Facebook had told the world a very simple story that was misleading. They had said, the way we make social media safe is we take down bad content. We do it after the fact, instead of building systems that are safer by design. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of little subtle choices Facebook makes every single day in how their products operate. So, for example, Should you have to click a link before you reshare a post? It sounds really simple. It's like, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. People should know what they're sharing. It turns out just requiring someone to click a link before you share reduces misinformation by 10 to 15%. We're not deciding which ideas are good or bad. We're building products that are safer by design. The problem with content moderation, censorship, is that it might work moderately well in the United States. I think it causes a lot of conflict. People get paranoid. No, there's major issues around like what gets taken down, what gets left up. But the reality is that those systems do not scale. You have to rewrite them language by language. And there are 4,000 or 5,000 languages in the world. And Facebook has any safety systems in maybe 60 of them. The reason why this matters is when it comes to things like hate speech. So I'm not talking about this post is hateful. I'm talking about really basic things like extreme racial slurs. We have seen really conclusive research in places like Germany, where the more extreme racialized language, I think you can think of some serious racial slurs, the more that circulates on Facebook, the more it normalizes the idea that we can talk to each other that way. And the thing about language is it actually does translate into the real world. I came from Singapore right before I came to Australia for another conference. And a number of German researchers presented on how when Germany passed laws that said, hey, we have had laws for 70 years that say you cannot use extreme racial slurs in newspapers and on the radio. Whatever is illegal offline needs to be illegal online. So overnight, the number of extreme racial slurs plummeted. And you could see in the data that there were less attacks on immigrants, like people going and beating up immigrants overnight. How we talk to each other. It's not about ideas. It's about, do we give each other basic courtesy actually translates into expectations in the real world. So when we go and say, hey, Ethiopia, you have 105 million people. You're a third the size of the United States. But unlike the United States, you have 6 major language families, and the country is quite divided. You have 95 dialects, and those dialects can be very different. And these AIs that look at content are incredibly brittle. When we go to a country like that and say, we're not going to support any of your languages for safety systems, we put ourselves at the mercy of algorithms. So what's an algorithm? Remember I talked at the beginning about how I spent most of my career behind the scenes, very contentedly, working on systems that decide like which video should you see next. Those algorithms can be designed in a lot of different ways. We can design algorithms that say, if you're good at talking to people very different than you, that you're having constructive conversations, that's good content. Versus saying content that gets the most clicks, the most comments, the most likes, the most reshares. That's the best content. When we have systems that prioritize what's known as engagement, so that's those clicks, those comments, those reshares, those likes, Facebook itself has been public since 2018 saying systems like that end up prioritizing, amplifying the most extreme content because people are drawn to click, even though when you ask them afterwards, did you like that? They say no. So let's imagine we're back in Ethiopia and people are starting there was literally a group of people who came online, people who were part of the diaspora from Ethiopia. These are people who left Ethiopia. They're not even back home. And they started pushing extreme content calling for violence into the Ethiopian version of Facebook. And that translated into a civil war and it translated into a lot of people who were killed. It was really, really profoundly horrific. And it would be one thing if this was an isolated incident, but we've seen it now multiple times. We saw it in Myanmar, which happened back in 2016 and 2017. The UN wrote a 200-page report talking about how Facebook's kind of ignoring this part of the world, but still operating there, being a business there, led to the deaths of 25,000 people. And it's not just Facebook. These same algorithmic systems, the same neglecting smaller languages, played out just last year in Kenya. When I came forward, I said, I think there's 5 years before we start seeing violence caused by TikTok. And yet, and the reason for that was, pretty simple. Video is more complicated than, I'm trying to figure out where to move my light. My Airbnb has very bad lighting, so I had to move outside. But now I'm in this I want to be bathed in sunlight kind of thing. With systems like TikTok, we end up in a world where, there we go. With systems like TikTok, we put ourselves completely in the hands of the algorithm. We say, we're not going to focus on social relationships. The algorithm is just going to give you things that it thinks you're going to like. And videos take more bandwidth. They take nicer phones to present. I thought we had time. I thought TikTok wasn't going to penetrate the most fragile places in the world. And what we discovered last year was during the Kenyan elections, the same thing played out that played out in Ethiopia. People who didn't live in Kenya started pushing violent content, stuff saying, you should go and hurt other people. This election isn't fair. And people died. There were violent riots in Kenya. And I talked to someone who worked on election safety at TikTok while these deaths were occurring. And she said there were no safety systems at TikTok that were supporting Swahili, which is the dominant language in Kenya. Think about that for a moment. You have an election coming up. A private company says, we're going to save money. We're going to cut costs by not supporting a language that's spoken by hundreds of millions of people across Africa. But we're going to continue to operate in those places. And so in the end, that's why I came forward. We have been told that censorship, content moderation is the path forward, and yet is a path that inherently leaves behind people in the most fragile places in the world. And if we want to not look forward 20 years and see these cycles of violence continue, we need to step up and say, we need transparency for these systems. We need to have conversations about how they operate and work. And so thank you for inviting me today. I'm very excited to be here. My family goes back in Iowa all the way to my great-grandfather, who moved here from California to teach at the University of Iowa. And my parents still live in Iowa City. They both, my mother came back to Iowa after her father left. And she and my father have taught in the University of Iowa for decades. So I'm very grateful to everything the state of Iowa gave me. And I'm proud to represent it as I wander out throughout the world. And I'm so happy to be here. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Francis. And I'll start with some questions. And if folks have questions, they can use the chat feature on the screen and they will get passed, and I'll work them in to the conversation. You mentioned a little bit.
And I want to remind people, this is complicated stuff. It's maybe the first time you've talked about this or thought about this. And while if you want much more detail, that's written in a very straightforward way. You can read my memoir, The Power of One, which came out this summer. Today, if you want to ask even basic questions, there's no stupid questions. We're here to begin wherever people begin, because this is an issue that impacts our democracy and our society, and everyone deserves to understand and have a voice.
And Francis, along those lines, I was curious, when you talk about transparency being so important to these algorithms, what's gained by that, and what's been the reasoning to keep it secret?
Sure. So it's interesting. We are living in a really interesting moment in our economy at large. So this is not just a Facebook problem. This is like a thing that we're going to have conversations about over and over again. If we went back in time to the 60s, or 50s, the economy was run by systems that were relatively transparent. If you buy a car, you can take that car apart. You can confirm, does that car do what they say it does? You can test the paint, see if it has lead in it. You can look at the emissions. You can see what is the impact of this vehicle. You can go outside the factory and put sensors down, or test the water, test the soil, test the air. When it comes to social media, we don't have that ability. Each of us sees only what's on our own screens. And that's why I founded my nonprofit, Beyond the Screen, because right now we need to see beyond just what we as individuals see. Transparency matters because right now, just to give you a sense of difference between like different things you interact with, if you and I know this is gonna sound impossible, but it is true. If you and I sat down for 3 weeks, I could teach you enough programming. You could ask basic accountability questions about Google. You know, what kinds of stuff gets distributed on Google the most? You know, how does it get prioritized? How is the page structured? And if we want to do the same, just basic level of accountability for Facebook, because we all see a different thing, because on Google, we largely see the same thing. Just like little tweaks. Like if you search for zoo in Des Moines, you're gonna see a different thing. If you search for zoo in Seattle. Because we all see a different thing, we would have to recruit 20,000 volunteers to let us put little programs on their phones or on their computers so we could see what they saw, which is like orders of magnitude more difficult to ask basic questions. So I call companies like that, ones where we can't really inspect what's going on, opaque systems, right? So these large language models like ChatGPT, that's an opaque system. Facebook is an opaque system because we can't, you know, go and crash test social media like we can crash test a car. And the consequences of that are when our economy is run more by opaque systems instead of transparent ones, it means that inside those companies, there's a constant temptation to begin to have the story that the company tells deviate from what is the truth of that company, like what it's actually experiencing, what's actual impact is on the world. And so when I talk about transparency, I talk about the idea that researchers, civil society, people should be able to ask questions about these systems. You know, what are we seeing or not seeing on Facebook or Instagram? You know, what is YouTube prioritizing? Like what makes something good in the eyes of YouTube or TikTok? When it comes to TikTok, this is particularly important. TikTok is highly influenced by the Chinese government. They claim their CEO sits in Singapore, and yet multiple whistleblowers have come forward and said other executives in the company who sit in Beijing are the real ones who direct where things go. You know, when it comes to TikTok, you know, we don't know why we see what we see. If China were to invade Taiwan, I guarantee you there won't be any Taiwanese content on TikTok or like pro-Taiwan content on TikTok. It'd all be about like why the war is going badly and like why, you know, Taiwan's really part of China. And so we need to say we need different expectations for companies that are opaque because we want to incentivize their story to be aligned with their real reality because it's one, good for the public good, keeps people from cutting corners. But second, because, you know, it makes the employees inside those companies happier and more able to do their jobs. You know, it really hurts to hold a lie, you know, to carry a secret. And companies where the truth begins to diverge more and more, they can it's kind of like, you know, cheating on your taxes or like lying in your accounting to your board. You know, you can begin to lie and you can dig yourself deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's very hard to get back up. And so that's part of why I push for transparency so much.
One of the questions that I have is also, we saw reductions in staff at Facebook earlier this year. I think the changes at Twitter have been fairly well documented. Are things moving in the right direction on the safety front, or is it becoming an increasingly Wild West?
Great question. So if you look at the year right after the Facebook files was published, you know, I thought it was really a great symbol of like what transparency can do because Facebook came out almost immediately and said, we are going to double our spending on trust and safety. Like, we are sorry, we've seen the light, we're going to do a better job. And they did do a better job. Like they built out teams to focus on more different kinds of social harms. They hired more moderators of more languages. They got more equitable. They got more effective. And unfortunately, Elon Musk bought Twitter, X, and came in and fired half the company, and then another 25% of the company left. So now we're down 75%. And there weren't any real consequences, right? Like the reality is right now, because these systems aren't transparent, you can take from the social side of the balance sheet to prop up your economic balance sheet. And the only thing you have to tell the public is like, what's your profit? What's your loss? What's your expenses? And in a world like that, you know, you can cut corners, you can take from society, you can make a more dangerous product, and no one really knows. Elon Musk even turned off the one little glimmer of transparency we had basically of social media, which was something called the Twitter fire hose, which allowed people to see what was being posted on Twitter. He did that by making it incredibly cost prohibitive for researchers. So he made it so that it cost tens of thousands of dollars per month to ask those basic questions. And other people in the social media industry saw there were no consequences. So Mark Zuckerberg came out and said Elon Musk was a real trailblazer. He showed you could rip the Band-Aid off and there'd be no consequences. You could fire your trust and safety teams. And some of my favorite researchers, people who stuck through when our team got dissolved, people who'd been there for 7 or 8 years, PhD level researchers, are gone from Facebook because they got fired. They did a really good job on really hard problems for years and years and years, and they're all outside of Facebook now because Facebook said, hey, we can cut corners here. And because we don't have to show you what's actually happening on our platforms, we're going to get away with it. So I'm very worried right now. I think going into the 2024 election, we know that the number of people working on election safety is down like 80% or something insane. And so it's one of these things where there won't just be an election in the United States in 2024. There's other major elections happening simultaneously. And so it's going to be a zesty election season, seeing like what plays out.
And you mentioned TikTok, and there's been some discussion in various states about, ban TikTok. Is that an effective policy solution, or would you advocate different policy solutions?
Great question. So I am a big proponent of divestment. So there has been a historical precedent that if a company is viewed as a national security issue, that the United States has gone in and said, hey, you can continue to operate, but you are going to have to change who your ownership structure is. You're going to have to change executives. I think that is a more constructive solution for TikTok than straight out banning it. Though you can imagine things like temporarily banning it as a negotiation measure. The reason why this is so important is right now, a growing percentage of people under the age of 35 get their news from TikTok. When you poll people, it's like 30% of people under the age of 35 say they get their news from TikTok. So imagine a world where we have a foreign actor whose product behaves differently in its own country than in our country. So, for example, in China, they know that social media has an impact on kids. And so kids can only use it 40 minutes a day. The average teenager in the United States uses 3.5 hours of social media every day. So it's not just TikTok, it's Instagram, it's Twitch, it's YouTube, it's other things. Think about that for a second. Like, you know that 40 minutes is like what you can do in your own country, but you let kids be on TikTok. I think it's like 95 minutes a day is the average of that 3.5 hours of social media. That's what's allocated to TikTok currently for the average child in the United States. How do you justify that? And like when the Senate asked that question, it was like, hey, like you put time limits on these products for kids in your own country. Why don't you do it here? And they were like, there are different laws in China. And it's like, I wish we could keep our kids safe. Or like, I'll give you another example. The average kid in the 30% of kids in the United States, teenagers, say they are on screens till midnight or later most school nights. So if it's 30% till midnight, it's another 10% till 2 a.m. In China, they cut kids off at 10 p.m. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the solution, but we should be asking, how is it possible that this foreign company can sit in their own country, say, we know that sleep is one of the most important things for kids' health and their futures. Sleep deprived kids do worse in school. That lives with them for the rest of their lives. It changes how their brains develop. Like you can see it on MRIs, kids who've been sleep deprived throughout their teenage years. That does things like increase the chance of mood disorders. So that's things like depression, bipolar, and things like more serious things like schizophrenia. Increases chances that kids use drugs, uppers because they're tired, downers because they're depressed. Increases chance they'll die in accidents, like not just car accidents, but just general cause accidents. This is a serious issue. And I don't feel like we have seen from TikTok a willingness to engage.
The Surgeon General put out a statement earlier this year about social media or social platform safety in kids. Do you feel that that's something that may spur some of the discussion? Because we've seen things historically on the policy front kind of start to happen. Smoking, and some of those types of things the crackdown started to happen with liability after Surgeon General action. Does that, do you hold out hope on that?
I actually do. So it's one of these things where people don't really have context on like what is the significance of one of these Surgeon General advisories. So in the United States, there have only been on the order of 10 to 15 of these advisories since the 1960s. So in the last 60 years, there have been like 10 to 15. So think about that for a moment. These are things like seatbelts save lives, smoking causes cancer, breastfeeding babies is good for them, like makes their brain stronger, immune systems. Obesity increases mortality rates, like stuff that we kind of take for granted today. Before those advisories happened, it was like there was still disagreement on what, on these issues. And the Surgeon General's advisory acted kind of like a period at the end of the sentence. It's like, now we can say, we're no longer in a period of confusion. Seatbelts save lives. And people did things like pass seatbelt laws, go after the cigarette companies. Historically, within 2 to 3 years of these advisories, usually there's some kind of action. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that the Surgeon General's warning is like a first step in the right direction. But the U.S. people need to actually stand up and act, call their senators, say, we need to act to protect kids because they're our future. And social media right now is stealing from them like the ability to interact with each other or like the ability to know the truth. So acting sooner is better than later.
You've been traveling internationally on this issue. Are you seeing policies and are other countries more receptive than the United States?
I wouldn't call it the United States isn't as receptive. I would say that our Congress is going through some growing pains right now. I mean, like, do we have a speaker? I'm in Australia, so I haven't been following really closely. Like, do we have a Speaker of the House yet?
Not yet.
It's like it's shocking. And so I think once we fund the government in an ongoing way or like other critical things, it's easier to have conversations about other topics. Other countries have slightly more stable systems, so it's easier to talk about the big issues. I think the other thing too is Facebook. This is going to sound crazy. The product we use in the United States is safer, cleaner, better taken care of than it is in Europe, than it is in Asia, than it is in Australia even. And that's because Facebook knows, Meta knows that they're an American company. Like they can make it, the government could be doing oversight if the government wanted to. And so, yes, the European Union has acted. They've come out and said that information asymmetry, where Facebook can hide the important parts of the conversation when it doesn't want us to see them. Or worse, when researchers have uncovered the truth, Facebook has sued them. Contemplate that, right? Like a researcher at NYU discovered that the political ads database, the thing that Facebook was trying to do so that people could see if like lies were spreading online, she found that lots of stuff was missing, and Facebook responded by suing her. I know. In Europe, they're tackling that information asymmetry, the idea that the platform knows things that we don't, by saying, hey, we need a different relationship. Like, we're not going to tell you how to run your company. Like, you know how to run your company better than we do. But if you know there's a risk of something to society, you need to tell us about it. You need to come up with a plan on how to fix it. And because we know you're just not going to do it unless we're watching, you need to provide information to us on whether or not you're making progress. Oh, and by the way, researchers and civil society are going to get to ask independent questions for the first time, which sounds really basic, but no one in the world has the right to ask questions and get answers from these companies right now. Australia is really interesting. So I'm down in Australia right now. Spent the whole week talking to government people, doing some we say Canberra, they say Canberra here in Australia, their capital, next week, because they have historically been willing to act on issues like what's known as non-consensual naked imagery, right? So that's something called revenge porn. If you have a naked picture of yourself that you don't want online, someone else did it, you can actually call up the government here, and the government will get it taken down in like 24 hours. Like, there's some really basic stuff like that, or child exploitative imagery, right? The government makes sure that like kids are not being abused online. They have a long history of being willing to work with companies. Like, they have a different model of regulation. It's called co-regulation. Like, the European model is like, hey, we're going to impose a thing on you. The US is often like, at some point we'll get around to it. Australia kind of takes a middle path where they say, we're going to work with you on establishing standards. If they're not strong enough, we're going to go back and say, hey, you need to take another stab at that. How about you consider these things? And their attitude is very much one of like, companies actually grow better over the long term with some boundaries. And so we're down here right now talking about things like ad transparency. Like, think about all the ads that get targeted at you, right? Like, right now, you wouldn't know if you were being singled out for like a really, really specific ad. Like, we should have the right to be able to research what is going through the ad ecosystem. How is that operating? And I think it's one of these things where, when it comes to people's individual posts, I think reasonable people can disagree on like, should researchers be able to understand topics around it? Because it, could violate privacy. When it comes to advertising, I don't think advertising has any privacy. Like, this is commercial speech. Like, if you picked up a newspaper, we all see the same ads. It's just kind of giving that same basic level of transparency. And it's really interesting because in Australia, they have like more of an attitude of like, hey, we don't like to step in, but sometimes we need to step in to make sure that the baseline rules of commerce function. And so I'm very hopeful. And I'm very excited to work with countries like Canada. Like, I'm a fellow at McGill in Quebec. I'm willing to work with other countries that are willing to start moving down the road because they can provide, future tools that the US can choose or not choose to use. And I'm very excited to get to help in any way I can.
You've been talking a little bit about that, having researchers involved, and I think beyond the screen you have this duty of care project where you're trying to have a simulated social network. Is that to start to understand even some of the user behavior, or what is the kind of the intent there?
Yeah. So we have 3 projects. So we renamed duty of care to standard of care.
Okay.
Which is based around the idea that right now we don't actually have expectations for these platforms. Like we have some basic rules of the road around things like privacy. Like, you can't hold data for more than, I think, 90 days without like user permission. So like, you could say, please delete my data, and you need to get rid of it. But beyond that, we don't have an idea of like, is Facebook better than TikTok? Is Twitter worse than Facebook? Like what? How would you actually assess that? And so standard of care is we're going in there and making a taxonomy. So basically, we're making a list of harms that we know about. We're bringing together researchers to kind of synthesize like, what do we know about each of these topics? We're identifying what we call levers. So that's areas of opportunity for each harm to prevent or mitigate harm. And because we're doing it in a way that is structured, like we maintain connections between ideas, we can ask questions like, if we can only do a couple of interventions to make kids safer, what are the areas of opportunity that repeat, the levers that repeat over and over again across kids' problems? because the reality is resources are limited, right? We don't live in an infinite world. I'll give you an example. The most important lever across most kids' problems is helping kids go to sleep, like when they want to, right? Like making it easier for them to not stay up super, super late if they want to go to bed. Because right now we have a lot of kids that say, I'm addicted. I'm doing this compulsively. I know it's hurting my school or my health or my employment. I know this, and I still can't stop. Right? It's scary. That's the most important lever. Or like, let's keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms. We're trying to bring together information so that when we talk about something like that, like let's keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms, instead of saying, there's only one path from A to B, like let's check IDs. There's actually like 10 or 15 different ways you can find it under 13-year-old. We have lots and lots of options. And if we had the opportunity to sit around a table together and see the huge list of options, I bet there's things that we would say, okay, we feel comfortable with that being the floor. That's like the expectation of like, you need to at least try to keep under 13-year-olds off your platforms. The second project we're doing is called minimum viable queries, which is, okay, now we know the harms. Now we know the areas of opportunity to be able to work on those harms. Platforms should have to release data helping us understand the magnitude of each of those harms and whether or not they're even trying to pull the levers. Are they trying to get better? So that's minimum viable queries. What's that minimum amount of data we can get out of platforms? Because when we define the minimum, it's faster to get that data out of platforms than saying we need to give people raw access, like researchers raw access to ask any question they want to. This is like focusing them in a little bit and saying, at a minimum, we need to talk about these issues. The simulated social network is the kind of icing on the cake. So once we have a list of concepts where we say, hey, we need to understand how these forces play out in a simulated social network, and we have some data to let us make sure whatever we make is kind of aligned with what we see today, we can build what I call a lab bench for teaching data science and teaching about the options we have in designing these systems. So if we were going to talk about teaching chemistry, the lab bench that we use in high school chemistry is actually very similar to the one you're going to use in college chemistry or graduate students use or full-blown researchers in the field. We have a lab bench for teaching intuition about those things and being able to, experiment and tweak. There's a lot of solutions for dealing with misinformation that aren't about this is a good idea or that's a bad idea. They're about, for example, we know the algorithms push us towards fewer and fewer voices. Maybe a small percentage point, maybe under 10% of people get to make up 90% of all the conversations. In other countries, it's not 10% or 12% like it is in the United States. It's like 1 or 2% of Facebook's users make up 90% of what everyone else hears. That's really scary because now basically they have a megaphone to influence society. If you want to do something like a headwind, so like if you drive your car, the force the wind puts on your car doesn't stay the same. As you drive faster, there's a little bit more force all the time that pushes back on you from the wind. When it comes to social media, you can imagine having a system that gives a little bit of a headwind to content as it starts to go viral, because that will mean the highest quality content, stuff that's actually good, ends up being the stuff that gets most distributed. Those kinds of interventions are almost impossible to test straight up on Facebook because they touch everyone at the same time. It's very hard. But if you could simulate those things, you wouldn't just be able to teach high schoolers, college students about the choices that go into the design of these systems. Think of it like high school newspaper, right? But for the information age. You wouldn't just teach kids about like, how do these critical systems work? You'd also provide a lab bench that lets, researchers inside these companies try out innovations like that headwind. So that's how our 3 projects kind of work together. We want to get on the same page around the world about what the dangers are and what the opportunities are. We want to get the data of the companies to understand how bad are things and are they trying to make them better? And then we want to build a lab bench so that we can have data science clubs in high schools where we teach about these issues. We can have fun, real world classes in colleges. Because right now, the way we teach people to use numbers to understand the world, we give them a lot of what I call toy problems. So they'll do things like say, here's all the rainfall for the last 6 months. Guess the height of the river. The real thing we need to be teaching these data scientists is, when you get into an industrial machine learning company, like it could be Google, it could be Facebook, it could be OpenAI, very rarely will the answer to ship a new version of the product or ship a new product be a very clean, it's better, it's worse. Instead, there's going to be 20 or 30 stakeholders for that change. And some of them are going to win and some of them are going to lose. Do you ship? And that way of thinking about the world, the idea that it's not homogenous, isn't obvious. And right now, we don't teach that kind of thinking until someone shows up at Facebook. And so the hope of the simulated social network is we can start to have those conversations sooner, so that the young professionals that show up at these companies already are thinking about their impact on society and the impact of these products on the world.
Now, we've talked a lot about social platforms, but I'm curious with AI, that's an opaque, with your definition, I would think you would classify it as an opaque system. What parallels and as we approach policy there, what do you see parallels?
You bet I do. I write about this in the book. So my memoir is called The Power of One. It got NPR's Book of the Day back in June. I talk a lot in that book about the idea that when it comes to things like AI, it runs on a data center or it runs on a chip on your phone. Like we currently don't have the rights to interrogate those systems. We want to expand standard of care, maybe in 6 months or a year, to have what we call scenarios. So, for example, one of our harms to kids is contact with dangerous adults, like pedophiles that groom. Right now there have been examples that have been published of, say the some Snapchat AI, when kids ask about their much older boyfriends. So they set up these accounts that pretend to be 13-year-old girls. They ask about their 25-year-old boyfriends, and the AIs give them advice on like how to hide their boyfriends from their parents, or like going out of state with their, their much older boyfriends. We should have some place where we write down expectations for how we expect technology to behave. And what's interesting is we can actually have AIs talk to AIs. Like once we have that list of scenarios, you can say, hey, AI, pretend to be a 13-year-old girl. Try to get information from this other AI on how you want to go on this little mini vacation with it. That kind of being able to grade AIs on things that matter is actually kind of novel. Like a lot of the test sets, so these are things they use to test these machines today, they're much more basic. It's things like, can a language model get logic problems right? Can it do math correctly? Having like expectations and like societal license test set, I think would be really important. But the second thing is incentives. So like the two main things with social media that we got wrong. First was transparency. We don't know what's going on. The second is we didn't think enough about incentives. So when it comes to AI, what are the incentives? So right now, this is a repeat of social media. Whoever moves the fastest is being rewarded with the most additional investment, the most customers. We're back in the era of move fast and break things when it comes to generative AI. Sorry, it's the morning here. Yeah, it's been fun watching kind of the sunrise. There was no sun here when we started. When it comes to AIs, we're back in the era of move fast and break things. If you are making more progress, you get rewarded And what's scary for me about that is safety isn't necessarily obvious. Like if we don't have the right to set up accounts and be able to like actually go and grade the AIs, there won't be incentives for them to do responsible things. The incentives are to cut corners, move fast. One thing we can do, and I'm always focused on what can we do? How do we make different decisions? How do we actually solve problems? You know, I'm an engineer by training. What if the Fortune 500 came out and said, "Hey, we need to change the incentives. Like we're going to be putting trillions of dollars into these systems in the next couple of years. We will only buy products from people who develop their AIs in responsible ways, safe ways. You know, they make their data available. They have published safety plans. You know, like this is what we're working on. This is what we're going to do next. You know, this is our values." Having that kind of explicit set of incentives then gives people the space to be able to come in and say, we're going to prioritize working on safety. Because now safety is a profit center, not a cost center. And so that's where I see the parallels. So transparency and incentives.
Okay. I wanted to ask a couple Iowa questions. You spent the COVID pandemic back here, and I was curious. You know, that was also you talk about that in your book, traveling back, and I'm curious the impact that your family had, just even on the decision, you know, to be a whistleblower. What was that like, to be weighing what to do? Was it an advantage to be home? Was it an extra, you know, stress?
Stressor?
Yeah.
So I feel super grateful that I moved back to Iowa during COVID. So I was there for the first 6 months of COVID. Ironically, the man that I went on to marry also moved back with his parents in Atlanta for the beginning of COVID. And I feel super grateful that I had that opportunity because when I first started working with my whistleblower lawyers, they would, I get to go back to bed for like an hour and a half when we're done. I'm very excited, as much as I love being here with all of you. When I first started working with my lawyers, they would give me this weird compliment, where like, imagine you're out having coffee with someone, or like you're on a first date and someone goes, "Ah, you are so stable. It's like wonderful." Like, imagine you got that compliment. Like, what would you do? So I have always been told that if you get a compliment and it makes you uncomfortable, the correct thing to do is not negotiate with the other person. It is to say, or like question them. It's just to say, thank you. Right. And my lawyers kept bringing this up. They'd be like, it's so nice. You are so stable. And what I learned was that most whistleblowers go through the process of blowing the whistle alone. You know, like they hold a secret that they know is impacting people's lives. They're surrounded by people who are telling them it doesn't matter or it's not a big deal, but they're overreacting. You know, most whistleblowers hold that secret alone. And because I was living with my parents, I could talk to them about it. You know, they could hear meetings when I would forget to put my headphones on or whatever. They could give me a reality check of that I was not acting in, I did not have irrational beliefs or thoughts. Like this was real, this mattered. And I'm so grateful that I didn't have to go through that experience alone, because I know that I had a much easier whistleblow, because by the time I actually did start gathering information, giving it to the SEC, I had already had a chance to kind of process all those feelings by living with my parents. And so I am extremely grateful to the state of Iowa for giving me shelter during a stressful time, and to my parents for helping make that happen.
I was also just curious, as we kind of close out our time together, you know, advice. Did you ever think when you were at West High in Iowa City that your career would take you here? And what advice do you have for that next generation behind you?
So it's interesting, you know, I've talked to a number of other people who are, you know, pretty high. I've talked to a number of people who are pretty high profile. And across the board, they've had similar experiences to mine in that when we talk to college students, people say things, or high school students, people say things like, I could never be you. You know, like, I'm not that brave. I'm not that smart. You know, like, I can never be you. And the thing that every one of those high profile people has told me is they were like, when I was 18, when I was 16, when I was 19, I was also really scared and shy and small, right? That the thing I always tell people is the key in life is growth and being open to new experiences and putting yourself in places that you stretch and grow. And so my number one piece of advice to people is following your heart, you know, figuring out how to live a life that is aligned with things that you enjoy every day or your values is really, really important. You know, it's a thing that actually can keep you going when things are hard. And the reality of life is that, you know, our paths are not set when we are 14 or when we are 19 or when we're 22 and graduate from college. You know, we get to wake up every day that we get to wake up and say, you know, what do I want to do today? Like, how am I going to change my life? How am I going to move forward? And the thing I would say to people is dream big. You know, there's like a corny saying, like, when you aim for the moon, you can land in the stars. Or you aim for the stars, you can still land on the moon. And I think there's a huge truth in that, right? That if you come out and say, like, I want to live a life where, like, I can follow my heart, it's amazing what you can accomplish. And people do better. Like, the thing that defines what impact you're going to have by the time you're 40 is, did you quit? Did you quit when you're 27? Did you quit when you're 30? And doing things that you love or that are meaningful to you lets you keep going until you're 40, till you're 60, till you're 80. And so, you know, be open to that idea. Be open to the idea that you're going to do something that resonates for you.
All right. Well, Frances, I appreciate you taking time. It looks like a beautiful morning in Australia, much brighter than it was here. And so, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for spending time with us today. And I really appreciate it.
Very happy to be here.
Best of luck going forward. And thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Have a great day.